G'day, I'm Owen. This is the pub test. If you've seen the last 5 parts to this video about the Mary Kelly Miller's Court deep dive, then this is just all those 5 videos put into one. So you really probably don't need to watch it unless you want to watch it again, because there was a lot of information in it. So if you do, enjoy. G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined the pub test, and in this one we are looking at the Mary Kelly crime scene and the victim herself and the possible connections that we can make. Now, if you're a regular here to the pub test, as we've got lots of new viewers, you'll know that I have always struggled with the Mary Kelly crime scene as being part of the Jack the Ripper saga, because I feel if we took that one out and just look at it in isolation, well, a lot of other things make sense when it comes to Jack the Ripper, but trying to make most of the suspects fit this crime has always been a difficult thing for me. Now, we will be unpacking a great deal of information here, so without further ado, let's put it to the pub test. Now, Mary Kelly came from Limerick Island, and we will be talking a lot about people from Ireland in this, and some of them are very unsavoury, and I just have to make this point now that not everyone from Ireland is an unsavoury individual. In fact, I've got a good friend of mine who has Irish heritage. He's also bulletproof, Rick O'Shea. I'll just pause while you finish your laughter. If you need to hit the pause button a bit longer, then please do so. But getting back to Mary Kelly right now, it is just quite odd that even that detail, where she actually came from, is disputed. Like so many other things that she herself said, or at least Joe Barnett said, happened in her life. So it's stated that she had been married, but the husband died in a mining accident. She may have had a child. At one point, she was working as a high-end escort overseas, and then for whatever reason, ends up as an unfortunate in the East End of London. Now, there's so many differing reports even about what she looked like. Some say she was an absolute stunner, but the pictures that we see drawn of her don't suggest that at all. But she was doing better than most of the unfortunates, because she had her own lodging place. In fact, she had a steady boyfriend at the time in Joe Barnett. And yes, they did have difficulties, those two. Things weren't always going swimmingly well. And when her attack happened, they were separated. The real point being made here is we know so much about all the other victims. We can trace their family and know their history, including Elizabeth Stride, who came from overseas, and yet we know what happened in her home country before she came out to England. And her family can be traced back to there, but not so with Mary Kelly. And the majority of information we have, we're relying on the testimony of Joseph Barnett. And that can be very problematic in this situation, because he had probably good reason not to necessarily give the full detail, as we are going to talk about. Now, some of the things that we are discussing have been covered in previous videos, but there is a lot here which is new information, which I think really does paint the real picture of 13 Miller's Court and the demise of Mary Kelly. So initially, looking at Joe Barnett. So on the day when the attack happened, they were not living together. They were separated. And that is an important little detail, because it stated that Joe Barnett was on his way back to Miller's Court because he had heard of an attack that had happened, and he wanted to get back there just in case it could have been Mary Kelly. I find it odd that he was hoofing it back to 13 Miller's Court, and people ask him, what are you doing? Well, maybe Mary Kelly is the victim of this crime. Now, after a long delay, he's able to get inside the room with the police, and he identifies the body from the colour of the eyes of the victim and the hair. But that has never sat well with me at all. Now, I know we are all different, but that crime scene was absolutely horrific. The body on that bed was unidentifiable by so many different means, because whoever had performed this attack had made sure that it was going to be difficult to prove who that person was. And I myself would not be able to stomach being in that room for any amount of time. It just would have, I would have been totally ill. And I've mentioned before, many crime scene investigators are literally ill when they walk into some of these scenes themselves. So a person who goes into that room thinking it could be their loved one, even though they were apart, it seems like Joe Barnett, at least according to him, still had strong feelings for Mary Kelly, was able to take the time to look into the eyes to see the colour of the eyes and then also identify the hair. It just, to me, still feels like he was definitely going to say it was Mary Kelly who was in that room. And there's some other details. See, the body still had a piece of clothing, and he wasn't asked to ID that. Was that something that he would recognise Mary Kelly wearing? It said that Mary Kelly had some prominent front teeth or something very obvious about her dental, but they don't use that to identify the body. And also, apparently her ears were rather prominent, and again, that's not something that's mentioned. It's just the eyes and the hair. I would have thought, now I don't know if dental records were all that extant, or even if the teeth could have been recognised, even if they were still there, I don't know, but it just seems odd. But then what's more, so put yourself in Joe Barnett's situation. You've walked in, you've had to see this absolutely horrific scene and identify what you believe is to be your loved one, and then they haul you off for questioning. Now, admittedly, you always need to eliminate the spouse when you find a victim like that. The reason is this one really did seem like overkill. Now, overkill is described as a crime of passion almost, where the person just gets in such a frenzy because of personal feelings. They have an attachment to the victim and they just uncontrollably lose themselves. Now, that is not true of probably 4 of the other victims. See, Martha Tabram, who many people consider a Jack the Ripper victim, would be a classic of overkill, like 36 stab wounds, so that could have very well have been a personal attack for sure. But the other victims that are attributed to Jack the Ripper, 4 of the canonical ones, were almost clinical. Like they took the person's life and then were doing some bizarre surgery to remove organs on a few of them. But this Mary Kelly one, well, it went way beyond that. This did look very much like someone was making a statement. And so quite rightly, Joe Barnett is under serious consideration. And they just don't ask him a few questions. He's in there for hours. But with no proof, well, they have to let him go. And it's interesting that they never came out and said that he was innocent as such, but they really had nothing on him. And then because this was attributed to Jack the Ripper crimes, and it was pinned very quickly as one, well, they really had little evidence to pin him for the other 4. And so he just would have dropped off the radar. But what is interesting here, be with all the publicity, now this crime almost caused a riot. The people of the East End had had enough, and they're saying do something about this. So the inquest was held very quickly, and it did not go on for long, unlike many of the other crimes that had occurred. The inquest took days sometimes. There was even a break of a week in between a couple of these inquests before they picked up again. They wanted to get to the bottom of this, but at this particular one, now it was a different coroner, but anyone who basically wasn't towing the line that the establishment wanted were either bullied or ignored, because there were two people who definitely said they saw Mary Kelly after the time it was proven the person was murdered in 13 Miller's Court. And one particular lady who testified to that was effectively bullied and made to look silly at the inquest, so she backs away from the statement. And I can understand why you would, because you have nothing to gain. But that is also something that really raises question marks about the true happenings there in 13 Miller's Court. Also, the funeral is held very quickly. So Mary Kelly, the person in that room, is interred in no time at all, to the point where none of her family from Ireland were able to be in attendance. And that's the official record of that, which we are going to question. Now, it's possible that the family couldn't afford to travel to London to attend the funeral. It's also possible, and this will be explored later in the video, that they may not have wanted to identify with Mary Kelly because of the activities she was engaged in. And we're not talking about walking the streets and plying that particular trade as an unfortunate. No, there are suggestions that there were other things at play with Mary Kelly, and it may not have been wise for the family to say we know her, because retribution could have come back on them as well. But here's a very odd thing, and a little known detail about Mary Kelly. And that's that the police did have the letters that Mary Kelly is supposed to have received from her family back in Ireland. And they go back to find where these letters were posted from to talk to the family, and they're unable to do so. Remembering this was a big case. They wanted to get some answers and at least let the family know, but they can't find them. Which is the big reason as to why no family were in attendance, because they weren't notified. Nobody knew how to get in touch with them. So that brings a very interesting question. Who sent the letters? Where on earth did they come from? Well, now we get into Mary Kelly's real identity, possible real identity. Some of the papers in the day after this crime referred to her as Mary McCarthy. Yeah, and I know people say, well, that was just because she was staying at McCarthy's Rents. John McCarthy and his wife ran Miller's Court, so they bought it from a bloke named Miller. The court remained Miller's Court, but colloquially in the area, it was known as McCarthy's Rents. Because of that, and she was also staying in the unit right beside the shop, they may have thought that, yeah, she was a McCarthy. So it's just a bit of a misunderstanding. Yet, here is something. So the police didn't just stop at looking at trying to trace back the letters to see where they'd come from back in Ireland. They decided in the Limerick area, well, let's dig and find anyone who was born Mary Kelly. And they did. They did find one name that matched. But the year of birth was different to what Mary Kelly said, but that's probably not to be surprising, because they often would use different years of birth, and records weren't great. But the intriguing thing here is those parents to this Mary Kelly, well, the mother's maiden name was McCarthy. And so it's possible the papers weren't just reporting a misunderstanding because she was staying at McCarthy's Rents. She may have been using that name McCarthy as well, because many people used multiple names back then. And then that raises an intriguing thing. Was there an actual blood relationship between John McCarthy and Mary Kelly? It is possible, because people say that would explain why she was allowed to get so far behind in the rent that Joe Barnett said, which was verified by John McCarthy. Now, if it was a cousin or some type of relative, you might just be that bit more lenient. Some people have made the claim that maybe John McCarthy was able to come in and use Mary Kelly's services, and that's maybe why he let the rent go for so long. I don't believe that at all, for reasons we're going to discuss very shortly. But I will make this statement. It is funny that if you meet someone of your same last name, well, you sort of feel a bit of a connection, don't you? Somewhere down the track, you're related. And you just have that little bit more, I don't know, family feeling. And so that could very well explain why John McCarthy was allowing that situation to go on. Yet it doesn't explain what happened when the body was found. McCarthy does not act like a concerned relative. If you knew that person, and she'd been staying in Miller's Court for a little while, and it could have been a relative, you would not do what McCarthy did when Indian Harry, Thomas Bowyer, finds the body. So Indian Harry peeks through the window, which they knew was broken, because he could peek through the curtain through the broken window, and interestingly, from that broken window, you could reach in and undo the lock. Not that difficult. But he goes back, rightly, I would suggest, to John McCarthy and says, mate, we got a problem. And so McCarthy then looks through the window, sends Indian Harry off to the police, whilst for a good 8 minutes or so, he's still on site, but catches up with Indian Harry before he gets to the police station. And at the police station, he says, I sent Indian Harry off first before I came running. And then later on changes that story to say that they both left together. But it is, without doubt, McCarthy stayed behind for a certain amount of time doing what, we have to ask. Knowing he would have had access into that room, though we know that his shop that he ran at Miller's Court, well, was probably doing some illegal activities and may have been supported a little bit in those illegal activities by Sergeant Thick, which I've discussed in a previous video as well. Yeah, McCarthy wasn't on the level. He wasn't just an honest shopkeeper. And he was allowing unfortunates to have lodging in Miller's Court, which was illegal. And I would say that he probably was getting extra money for allowing that to happen, sort of charging a premium for those rooms. But that activity alone could have put him in prison, but who knows what else he had to hide before he knew the police were going to swarm around his shop and his lodging places. And it has been discussed previous to why the police waited outside Miller's Court for the bloodhounds to turn up. Yes, they were getting bloodhounds to try and trace Jack the Ripper, but the bloodhounds weren't of use in this situation. And after quite a few hours, McCarthy knocks the door down to get inside. Again, that is strange when they know the window's broken. They know they could probably reach that lock. It really wasn't a complicated process. So why did he go to the process of knocking the door down? Well, it probably didn't bother him, because people say, why would you knock down your own gear? Well, that place was going to get boarded up anyway, so who cares about the door? But this scene was so horrific, it actually led to some of the very first known crime scene photos, and they are out there. And unfortunately, as we go through this story, we will be looking at some detail of some of the injury on the person found inside 13 Miller's Court. But the strangest part to all of this is not long after this most brutal crime, and the outrage in the press was huge. The people on the street were going to riot. They wanted something done. The police needed this sorted. All the interest and all the investigation just drops off a cliff. This ended the Jack the Ripper saga. So the question is, if the bloke wasn't caught, why? Well, let's look at the first suggestion. So it's important to note that the Jack the Ripper crimes didn't happen in isolation. And what I mean by that is that other things were happening in London and England in 1888. Quite some significant events. Now, the Industrial Revolution had been in full force for quite some time. The landlords, who made up the House of Lords, were losing their power to socialism. And it's not the weird socialism that we might automatically think of when we hear that term, but workers were starting to get rights. And they were saying, well, we don't need to do this subsistence farming and paying you blokes money. We can go make money in the cities. But then the workers were finding that maybe some of these people running the factories weren't helping them either. So the rise of the worker was really starting to come to the fore, including an event known as Bloody Sunday in Trafalgar Square. Though that particular event that happened during this time was paled into insignificance from a very similar event 100 years prior. That was becoming more and more difficult to do. Now, even though there was now a paid police force, it was still in its relative infancy, and so quieting, or quelling, I should say, these riots wasn't exactly all that easy. But added to that, they had all this immigration going on, so like social, racial tensions were on the increase. You see, now the authorities, with all this going on, were worried that there could just be an absolute revolution. I mean, that happened in other parts of Europe, getting rid of the monarchy. And in England, that was on the cards. There were plans. But there was one other issue that really was a hot potato that the authorities had to juggle. And that was the Fenian movement. Well, the Fenians were a forerunner for what I grew up with being the IRA. And when I say grew up with, what I saw on the media in Australia. And not the IRA as we know it today, but the organisation that went around planting bombs and telling people to get out all around England. Now the thing is, why was this being done? What was the issue? Well, I know it's a very sensitive political subject and I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I will, perhaps for the sake of those who haven't lived through that experience, like people such as myself, because many people are watching this from all around the world. So what was the issue between the Irish and the English in the 1880s? Well, as it's probably well known, the British Empire wanted to expand. And so they had a reach at one point covering a vast majority of the globe, including what is now the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and a large part of Southeast Asia. But as was the normal case when they went and conquered a land or took it over, started to colonize in places, it was very easy for them to basically say the indigenous folk are somehow less than human. They have a different skin colour. They speak a very weird language. And they've got their religious practices are just absolutely barbaric. Unlike us, who are very cultured. We're actually bringing culture to these civilizations, and they will benefit for it. So that was a very easy sell to the public, because people will go, well, that's true. That actually works. The problem here with Ireland, when they looked across the waters, well, there was a group of people that looked not too much different. They shared a very similar genealogy. They also had a similar religion, not the same. In Ireland, they stayed loyal to the Pope, so they were predominantly Catholic, whereas, very famously, England broke away from that, and so it was a Protestant country. And that was the point of difference that they could use to subjugate the people and sell that notion to the populace back in England. But how did England manage to take over Ireland? And here's just a little bit of also interesting information that's probably not well known around the world, because in Australia, we basically say island in the sense of it's an island. Like Australia is an island. And you look at that country and you think, well, is that why it got its name? Did the British go, well, we want that island? Well, actually, no. The land was known as, no, I can't say it exactly right, but basically Ira. That was the name of a god, and that's what the locals called this landmass. So when the English took it over, they basically gave it the name Ireland, being the land of that god. So it's not, when you hear it said properly, that someone's getting it wrong. They're pronouncing it correctly. We here in Australia definitely got it wrong, but just by saying island. Total side tangent. But the thing, how did Britain manage to take over the country? Well, the problem in Ireland was that there was no central governing power. It was made up of what they say was petty kingdoms. And I would suggest that these leaders were a little bit petty in themselves because, they decided that, they would fight amongst themselves pretty well much. And they didn't really worry about a threat from outside. So when the British came in, it was not much for them to just walk through and take over the country. But as I said, how could they really subjugate the people? Well, they introduced what is known as penal laws. Now, penal law means a penalty. Now, let me read to you just a quick search to explain what a penal law is. And I quote, "Penal laws are a set of laws, often discriminatory, that impose specific punishments or restrictions on certain groups of people. Historically, penal laws have been used to enforce religious or political conformity, as seen in the penal laws against Catholics in Ireland and Britain and against the Welsh. These laws can restrict civil and human rights, limit access to education, employment and land ownership, and even impose severe penalties like death." Well, that was what happened to the Irish people. So when England took over, they kicked the Catholics off their land and installed good Protestant people. Now, could you imagine how you would be if you had been farming a land? And it wasn't an easy existence. Farming wasn't what it is today, but you'd been doing that for generations. And then these foreigners come in and say, well, because you have a different belief, you can no longer farm. You're out. We're going to set up landlords over you. But you know what? We'll do you a favor. We'll let you back on to your own land. You can farm it, but you got to pay the landlord. And it's not going to be cheap. You could see why the people there would definitely be upset with that. Added to the fact they could never own that land again. It was banned. They were restricted with education. All these things the penal laws were meant to do to keep people from rising up any social ladder, any economic ladder. There was just no hope for them. But over time, attitudes did begin to change. It was noticed that it was probably not the best way to get the most out of a people. You still needed them to produce. Because if they were not making produce, that was not going to help you. And that's probably the reason why you took over that country in the first place, is to get some resources back. And so they started realizing, the British that is, the authorities, not the people, by the way. When I'm saying this, it's not against the British people, but it was the authorities were doing these things. They realized that, we need to make some changes. So they decided they might do what was known as Home Rule. It was a law trying to be implemented in the British Parliament, which meant that the people in Ireland would have some type of self-determination, not independence. They would still be subject to the monarchy and Britain, but they would be able to have a fair bit of self-determination on how they would run their own country. Well, this was a huge issue back in the day. Prime ministers rose and fell on this particular issue. In fact, one very famous English prime minister, whose last name was Gladstone, he served 4 times as Prime Minister of England in his 3rd term, which happened in 1886. And this is important as we go through this. That year, 1886. Well, he got into power and he wanted to introduce this Home Rule Bill. Well, it split up his political party, the Liberals. And so that government collapsed. And a new bloke came in as Prime Minister, and he abolished it. He said, we are not going down that path of Home Rule. It was in 1892 that Gladstone was re-elected as Prime Minister, and he was managing to get this bill through, but it didn't fully pass until 1914. And it still took a long time before any restitution or any real changes were made for the Irish people. And I would say even in my time, even during the 1980s, the Irish people probably still felt like they were very hard done by. And the only way around that was true independence. Now, why I say 1886 was a critical year was because the Fenian movement was very active in the 1880s in England. In fact, it's said that between 1881 and 1885, they planted over 100 bombs around all of England, not just London, but everywhere. And yeah, they did all these attacks in a space of 4 years. So they were on a reign of terror. Now, interestingly, and I think this is important, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, so I am going out on a limb. They stopped in 1885, probably not just because of the police cracking down on them. But when Gladstone was going back to try to be Prime Minister, and he was running on this idea of implementing Home Rule, well, the Fenians probably realised they needed to stop just for a bit. They're not going to ramp up these attacks. Why? Well, whilst we may understand the feeling of these Irish people because of what was done to them, the reality is you needed the general public on side. And blowing up innocent people was not going to achieve that. So you could imagine that Gladstone is having conversations with these leaders of the Fenians saying, look, if you blokes just calm down, the right environment will be in place for us to actually, help you out. But if you keep on this path, the public will not vote me in because we don't want anything, like those blokes don't deserve anything. Look what they're doing to us. It's funny, we can understand why some of these attacks would happen, but we can understand why the general people in England probably didn't hold these Fenians in very high esteem at all. And just on a side note, I do find it funny how some people think that to right a wrong, you need to resort to doing even worse wrong things. Probably not worse. Okay, that's probably the wrong way of saying it, but, 2 wrongs don't make a right. I know it's hard when you're going through that situation. Fairly heavy topic. I'll leave that one there. But perhaps to sum up, desperate people will do desperate things. And so don't back people into corners is probably a good motto. But there is an event that happened in Dublin in 1882, and that was an attack on 2 political people. And it was done by a breakaway group known as the Invincibles. Now, Thomas Burke and Frederick Cavendish, they were meeting up. So Thomas Burke had just landed in Ireland. They're walking across this park, and then they got set upon by 11 of these Invincibles. And they had these 12-inch surgical knives. Now, they attacked Burke, and he got murdered in a way very similar to what happened in Whitechapel in 1888 to the Jack the Ripper victims. But then Cavendish came over to help Thomas Burke, and then he got set upon and was stabbed brutally with these knives. Now, these knives are important as we go through this story, and that's why I am bringing this up. But apparently the two main perpetrators of this from the Invincibles was Joe Brady and Tim Kelly. I do not believe that's any relationship to Mary Kelly. As we know, we don't even know if that was Mary Kelly's last name. But Kelly was a very common Irish name back in those days. Well, the police, when they were investigating it, did a tactic that is well known today. They basically separated these people and said, we know what's going on and the other blokes are talking, so to save yourself, tell us what happened. And oddly, the leader of the Invincibles, James Carey, well, he gave it up and he named all the people involved, with about 5 or 6 of them, including Brady and Kelly. Well, they were executed. But James Carey himself, well, not long after, he was found murdered too. And they made a song about him, not in a good way, but saying, well, this is what happens to people who basically give up the names of fellow Fenians. But remember those knives, because we are going to talk about them again a little bit later. But what I think is important here is it was 1886 when Gladstone lost the Prime Ministership and the Home Rule Bill just became a non-entity. It was not long after that the Fenian movement started planning more attacks. But this time, not just hundreds of random attacks are all over England. They were going to target specific high-profile buildings, like the Parliament House and the Palace. And also, as they did in Dublin in 1882, target senior politicians. Because now, with the Prime Minister that was in place, there was no way that Home Rule was going to come into law. So the police now had to be on extra guard. They had, and we are going to dive into this, a division to keep an eye on the Fenian movement. But the question is, what does all of that have to do with what happened in 13 Miller's Court and Mary Kelly? Well, there are two very viable theories. So let's put them to the pub test. Now, the first theory is that Mary Kelly was a police informant. And you'd be saying, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would someone who has Irish descent come over to London and act for the police to tell on her own countrymen? Well, it happens all the time, doesn't it? We see that authorities try and infiltrate into organisations, and that way they can stop bad things from happening. And knowing that Mary Kelly arrived in London in 1884, and it said that she came from Cardiff. Now, like most of this person's life, we know so little about it, there's doubt whether she ever was in Cardiff, because no records can be found. So it's safe to say that pretty well much all of her history is dubious. And we could say that records, and we have mentioned them already, that records could be the issue here, but we know so much about every other person connected with this case. So it does seem highly odd. But as a police informant, she had the perfect cover. She could go out to the pubs and sit there, have a few drinks. But if you were drinking gin, you could just as well drink water and pretend like you'd had a few. But the idea of being at pubs all the time, I mean, the old expression, loose lips sink ships. Like, you get a few drinks into you, lubricates the lips a little, and you start talking. And also, not only that, people after a few beverages tend to talk a little louder than they normally would. And because of that, it's easy to hear if you're in the next table over. And have you ever been out and you hear people having a chat and you go, I really should not be listening to this, but I can't help overhear it? Well, if you were Mary Kelly, sliding into these pubs, listening for conversations that are maybe being had by these Fenians, and they would be less guarded around someone who they knew was Irish. But also, what's she doing there? Well, as an unfortunate, that's where you would expect her to be. And then if you saw her later cavorting with someone maybe a little bit well dressed, having a chat to him, you wouldn't think anything of it. You'd think, well, they're just, like out to make some money. But it'd be an easy way for Mary Kelly to pass information on to the authorities. But there's just a couple of things to look at here. That Mary Kelly didn't exactly spend a long time working as an unfortunate. Remember, it's said, at least by Joe Barnett, that when they were together, she'd stopped doing that for a time. Now, their relationship is important as we discuss both these theories. But the question is, was his money enough? We see it's funny how, according to the records that we have, it wasn't. They were struggling financially, or so it is said. Again, we don't have exact records of what was going on in their life. But she could have been surviving by getting a little bit of paid money for being a police informant. But there is another slight possibility that we could raise as regards this particular theory. And that is perhaps John McCarthy was in some way involved as well. Because remember, Mary Kelly got that room in Miller's Court right beside the shop of John McCarthy. We have touched on the fact that perhaps Mary Kelly was a McCarthy as well. That could have been her mother's maiden name. That is speculation because we've got no idea who Mary Kelly is, but it is just interesting that's the only information that's been able to be dug up. So was it possible, though, that John McCarthy himself was an informant to the police? But could the police have been leaning on McCarthy a little? Because McCarthy it is an Irish descending name, so did they say to him, you give us a bit of information? Because all sorts of people are coming into your chandler shop to buy candles. And if you're just listening to this, you missed the little quotation marks. Because he was not just selling candles. He had some dodgy stuff going on. And perhaps they said either, you help us out, or we're going to ping you. We're going to put you away. Because we know you've got unfortunates staying in your rooms. You can go to prison, buddy, but we'll do a deal. So then how can he feed information? Maybe Mary Kelly and Joe Barnett, as we'll discuss, he lets them stay under one condition, that she finds information that he's able to give to the police. Well, it is a possibility. But right now, you'd be saying, Owen, that's a bit of a stretch considering the police involvement right there at 13 Miller's Court. That probably doesn't pass the pub test. Well, we are going to dive into that police investigation a bit later. And that will be very eye-opening. But you would also say, but didn't Mary Kelly owe John McCarthy quite the sum of money? Around 6 weeks of rent? That is also something we are going to look at. Because I got a question, or rather a scenario, to do with that. Now, this theory centers around the idea that the Fenians found out that she was an informant, or that John McCarthy was feeding information to the police. Or perhaps Joe Barnett. Either way, a message had to be sent. Fear had to be put into anybody that would speak against the Fenians. Remembering what they did to those people in Phoenix Park in Dublin in 1882. That was a statement. That was a message being sent out. And nefarious people do that sort of thing still today. And that would be why the attack was absolutely brutal. The person was totally unrecognizable, but in a short space of time, this made massive press. So the message was being sent for everybody to know, do not mess with the Fenian Brotherhood. Because this was no regular Jack the Ripper crime either. And as we've stated, it was so bad, it was the reason why they had some of the very first crime scene photographs. A lot of this theory, you would say, is just sensational, except there are some interesting and intriguing points that I feel often get missed. Now, we know that John McCarthy, after Thomas Bowyer, Indian Harry, saw Mary Kelly through that curtain, that's also odd, which we are going to talk about. But regardless, Indian Harry's off to the police first. John McCarthy catches up to him. So then on their way, they can come up with a story. And what is that story? Well, Indian Harry was going to check on the rent and get paid. And then he saw John McCarthy, and then they both went off to the police. Now, standing around outside that room is John McCarthy with the police. We're not touching on the police yet. That is later. But there were quite a few policemen and some high-ranking police outside Miller's Court when that body was found in there. But who else was standing outside the room? Well, remember, Joe Barnett had come down because he'd heard about what had happened at Miller's Court. So he, most likely, was also in attendance, remembering he was there to identify the body. And so, for hours, all these people are milling around. It'd be quite easy for McCarthy and Barnett to have a little sidebar and say, this is the story we're going to tell. We're going to say that Mary Kelly owed me 6 weeks' rent. So when the police ask you questions, and believe me, they're going to ask you questions, that's the story you're saying. And so a lot can be made about the fact that Mary Kelly owed that money, but we only really have Joe Barnett and John McCarthy to confirm that she was behind in the rent. And if they had seen that body, and it was Mary Kelly, they would have got the message. And remembering, Joe Barnett disappears immediately after this. The question would be why? Why, when, even though they weren't together officially at the time, he obviously, well, we would assume, still had strong feelings for Mary Kelly, would he not want to hang around his family, get that comfort and support? But he disappears. Well, that's the theory. There's one fly in this ointment, and the major one is Carolyn Maxwell. Now, she knew Mary Kelly for about 9 months and was adamant that she saw her after the supposed murder had occurred. She remembers the day very, very well. And there was another bloke who said, I also saw her even after Carolyn Maxwell did. Well, they didn't ask that bloke to come to the inquest, and Carolyn Maxwell, when she was facing the coroner. And this coroner was a different coroner to the other inquests into Jack the Ripper crimes, but he just bullied her, basically demeaned her and said, you could very well be mistaken. And eventually she says, well, I could very well be mistaken. But if she was right and the other bloke was right, then it wasn't Mary Kelly in that room. So then we would have to consider Mary Kelly as an operative for the Fenian Brotherhood. She was actually working with them, and it was not her in that room. It was a decoy. Some poor innocent person was attacked so that Mary Kelly could disappear. And you'd think surely someone would be missed. Well, remembering, and this will be important later in this video, but the Jack the Ripper crimes and the Thames Torso murders were happening in parallel, and there's only one of the Thames Torso victims that was ever identified, I believe. So there were lots of people that just went missing. And so one extra person here in this room, and no one really misses, wasn't that uncommon back then. I'm not saying it's right, it was just the way things were. But to consider this properly, we really need to look at the relationship Mary Kelly had with Joe Barnett. Now, we know that domestic violence is still rampant around the world now, and back then it was dreadful. I mean, in this channel, we have looked at some suspects of Jack the Ripper who treated women terribly in public, like William Berry punched his partner in the face at a pub and nobody did anything. Like, they didn't arrest him, they didn't charge him, they probably barely helped his poor wife. Well, that was the attitude back then. And sadly, things haven't changed greatly today, though hopefully just a little bit better. So it is possible that Joe Barnett was pressuring Mary Kelly into giving up information on fellow Irish people. Good reason for that we are going to talk about in a moment. But it's also known that women can be very manipulative as well, and they can get blokes to do things they normally wouldn't do, just with a bit of emotional blackmail or using other physical things to mold the behaviour of the person that they're with. And Joe Barnett appears to be in that category. I say appears because we're trusting what he's saying, but it would look like he would do anything for Mary Kelly. And then even when she kicks him out, and she kept the room at Miller's Court, he kept coming back daily and checking in on her. Even the morning when she was supposedly deceased, he's coming back to check because he'd heard something happened and he didn't want that to be Mary Kelly. Well, either scenario for Joe Barnett could be true. He could be the abuser, or he could be manipulated. But you'd ask why? Why would he be remotely involved with a Fenian conspiracy? Was he not a Londoner? Well, yes, but his parents were Irish immigrants who left Ireland during the Great Famine of the 1850s. And could you imagine then? And that famine was made worse by British rule. And that was a terrible thing. A mass migration happened during that time. We're talking millions of people left Ireland for other parts of the world. Hence, there's Irish communities in lots of places. Well, in the East End of London there was one, and Joe Barnett would have been told those stories. Do you think he had any real sympathy for the British rule? Most likely not. So it is possible that he himself was involved in some activities. Now the police, naturally, someone dies, you look at the partner, they drag him in there and they interview him for 4 hours. But then they let him go, and as I've already said, he disappears. Never to be seen again, or at least in any records, when he pops back up in the East End of London 20 years later. That does seem very, very suspicious. Particularly when he next turns up, he is with a woman, we assume married because she has the same last name. Could that have been Mary Kelly? Did they disappear together? Remembering Barnett had a big family around, you would have thought he just would have stayed there. That's what people did back then. It was rare for someone to just take off. Now, this theory that Mary Kelly lured someone else into the room, then they made the body unrecognizable. And I say they, because I don't believe she would have done this by herself if she did it at all, but they make the body unrecognizable. Joe Barnett identifies the body, and remembering it's known by the people in Miller's Court, she had other women in the room leading up to this event. And perhaps why she was seen the following morning by at least 2 people, she really wasn't exactly hiding herself. She may have thought they had more time before the body in 30 Miller's Court was found. Except for Indian Harry. that may have totally ruined the plan. Now, does anyone not think it weird? This bloke, in his 50s, goes to collect the rent, knocks on the door, and then pulls back the curtain because the window's broken and looks on in and sees the scene. I mean, maybe that's totally innocent behaviour. I don't know what it's like in the East End of London today or what it was like back then, but I'd say in my town, if I don't care who you are, if you're going peeking through someone's windows to have a good old look, and particularly if you can pull back the curtains to have an even better look, that just doesn't seem right. And so there's a possibility that he could have just been having a bit of a gander inside the room. Saw the scene, goes to John McCarthy, oh, I just saw this, and then they have to get a story. Mainly, what were you doing looking inside the room? I was sent to collect the rent, and hence that story got sorted out before they got to the police station, because that's just really odd. Now, you might think that this seems very far-fetched, that herself and Joe Barnett would go to this length to disappear. But what if the police had worked out who they were? They could have been looking at serious jail time, if not worse. It wasn't much for people to get executed for some of the crimes these Fenians were doing, and if you were an underling, well, they might even throw you under the bus, the Fenians would, because I will give the police a couple of lower level people, and that will make the population happy that the police are doing something about it. But you're the one that they're throwing under the bus, so you've got to disappear. But now you're saying, but Owen, there would have to be some physical evidence to prove either of these theories, that the Fenians had anything to do with what happened in Miller's Court. Well, again, we have to go back to 1882 in Phoenix Park in Dublin, when the Invincibles attacked those two politicians. The knives that were used in that attack were surgical amputation knives, apparently, and they were 12 inches long. Now, they did actually go back and investigate where those knives came from, because they were branded. They found 3 of the knives. So they go to the shop that made them and said, oh, yep, I've got, because you had to have records of who was buying them. One of the Invincibles had gone in and given a false name as a doctor and purchased 12 knives. Now, in their investigation, they only ever recovered 3. So where did the other 9 knives go? Well, now there is a major dispute about what was found in 13 Miller's Court. People look at the official police record and say there were no knives found. Yet, in photos, there are people that maintain that there's at least one knife in some of those photos. Now, they weren't like HD quality pictures. We're talking back in 1888. So you could probably see a lot of things in a picture that you'll want to see. I understand that. Yet there is record that from this scene, Scotland Yard had some evidence. And they had evidence not only of 2 knives that were about 12 inches long, that were surgical, and also a hatchet or a tomahawk, like a little small axe. And people point to some other evidence in these photos where it looks like one of the bones had been attacked with that type of implement. But these artifacts, I'll call them, or pieces of evidence, were stored in what was known as Black Museum. Now, the Black Museum was not open to the public, but it was what Scotland Yard held as souvenirs, I don't know, pieces of stuff they collected from crime scenes and other criminals. And they used it, they said, for educational purposes, to try and understand the criminal mind. And so they had in their possession 2 knives and a hatchet from Miller's Court. Now, it's said that the hatchet went missing. But why would you leave the knives behind? Well, that would be to send the message of who committed this crime. Because if they could pin these knives to that attack back in Dublin, and maybe other crimes that had occurred that we really don't have much evidence about, then they would know, the police would, that this was a Fenian attack. But what happened to those two knives? Because I believe a version of Black Museum still exists in Scotland Yard, but those knives aren't there. Well, you may be familiar with a famous ripperologist, Donald Rumbelow, who has in his possession Jack the Ripper's knife. It's believed to be that. How he came into possession of it is a story in itself. So Elizabeth Stroud was working as a secretary for a person in law enforcement, and she said he presented her with a box that had two knives and the box was blood-stained. And he told Elizabeth Stroud that these were Jack the Ripper knives. Now, she said she burned the box because it was filthy, gave one knife away, and kept the other knife. And then eventually, when she was getting older, she decided to hand the knife over to Donald Rumbelow. But this knife is only about 8 inches long, so it said. So Elizabeth Stroud said, well, I used the knife throughout my life, cleaned her up a bit, used it to carve the Sunday roast. That I find odd, like if you've got a knife and you know what it had been used for, and you're standing there carving your Sunday chicken. Is that the story you're telling to your guests, saying, oh, see this knife, it's a great one. You've got to know the story behind it. Interesting dinner conversation, I would say. But she also, during the war, World War II particularly, the metal in England was hard to come by, and so you used any implement you could to do anything. And so she said she was using it in the garden. And then it snapped off. So she took it to someone who repaired it. He fixed the snap and then put a bit of thumb guard or something else on the knife, handed it back to her. Hence, that's why the knife is now shorter than apparently what was found in that room. And so the provenance of this knife actually passes the pub test. It would make sense if this person took it from Black Museum and then handed it down. Well, it could have been well known as the knives of Jack the Ripper. But who was the person that gave these knives to Elizabeth Stroud in the first place? Well, he was actually born in 1888, and his name was Hugh Pollard. Now, he has quite an interesting history, which we are not diving into here, but today he would be known as either a racist, a raging racist, or a bit ignorant if we were trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, because he has reportedly said that all Irish people are prone to criminality. He was involved in basically counter-terrorism against the IRA, which was the new version of the Fenian Brotherhood in his time. So he's working with Scotland Yard against the IRA, and he was very interested in these knives. Now, is that just a coincidence? Or was there strong evidence that the authorities back in the East End of London in 1888 were honing in on a big Irish conspiracy? Well, the answer to that, I think you will find very surprising. Because the first policeman we are discussing who was involved in this case, I think is very intriguing, as we're going to see, and that's Inspector Abberline. Now, he was one of the police standing outside of Miller's Court, waiting for the hounds that Sir Charles Warren apparently wanted at the very next Jack the Ripper crime. But as we know, those hounds didn't turn up, but it was Abberline in the room looking at the evidence that they found. And he had taken a bit of charge, which is understandable because he was chief inspector. But first we have to bust a couple of myths about Inspector Abberline. Namely, that he was not the lead investigator of the Jack the Ripper crimes, as many fiction works would try to tell you. He was a bit player in this, but he was an important one though. But perhaps not for the reason that we would normally assume, because he may not have been having an active investigation into the crime scenes themselves. So why on earth was he there in the first place? Well, let's have a look at the history of Inspector Abberline. He was born in 1843, and at the age of 20 in 1863, he became a police officer. So he was PC Abberline. But very similar to someone well known in the Jack the Ripper saga, Sergeant Thick, Abberline made a name for himself very quickly and became a sergeant. But unlike Sergeant Thick, Abberline's career kept going upwards, and he soon became a detective. Yes, after only 4 years in the police force, in 1867, Inspector Abberline is actually working as a plainclothes detective. And what do you think he may have been investigating? Well, this might surprise you, but he was looking into Fenian activity. So the police interest in Fenian activity had been a very ongoing thing. But obviously, Abberline was very good at this work, because before long he not only became an inspector, but ended up being Chief Inspector of H Division, which was the division that looked after Whitechapel. But then in early 1887, he's transferred over to A Division, which I think is around Whitehall. So what was he doing back on the scene, back in H Division jurisdiction in 1888 during the Jack the Ripper crimes? Well, it is stated that he knew the area. So they seconded him back saying, well, you know what's going on. You know the streets. Well, that's the impression that we get, but that doesn't make a great deal of sense at all. Because the police on the beat would have known the streets. They would have known where the unfortunates were taking their customers. And I would suggest as an inspector and then as chief inspector, you didn't spend that much time out on the street at all. So I don't think they brought him back so that they could get a map out and say, well, where do you think Jack the Ripper might be hiding? But no. If he was overseeing the Fenian movements, it would make sense that you bring him back because he would have some connections. Maybe even some informants. But regardless, his reputation and his knowledge of Fenian movements would have meant that he could turn over a few stones, rattle a few cages, and maybe just find out, could this be part of some bigger conspiracy that's going on in Whitechapel? Now, interestingly, he was called back very quickly, not just because of the Mary Kelly crime that we're discussing here in detail. So that does suggest that the authorities at least wanted to investigate whether all these Jack the Ripper crimes were part of some big Fenian conspiracy. And that is also a theory that's out there, that all the crimes were committed by the Fenian movement to basically be a distraction so they could go on to do their main targets, which we are going to discuss at some point in this video. But I don't subscribe to that myself. I don't see that these 5 crimes were the work of the Fenians, because the Thames Torso murders were happening at exactly the same time. They were happening in parallel with the Jack the Ripper crimes. And yet, the police were at pains to state that those crimes, the ones where people are being amputated, had nothing to do with these others. Different people. That is intriguing as well. And I asked the question, remembering we've discussed the Phoenix Park murders, amputation knives were used. 12 knives were bought. They only ever found 3. And the Thames torso murders, the people were being amputated. So you'd actually think that the torso crimes would be more in line with the Fenian activity than the previous 4 Jack the Ripper murders. But regardless of all that, I believe Inspector Abberline was called back because he had connections. He could find out some information, and that's why I think it's quite intriguing that he was the one that turned up at Miller's Court, and why he was the one who interviewed Joseph Barnett. Remembering he was no longer in this jurisdiction, and jurisdiction was fought by people back in those days massively amongst police forces. Could you imagine a local, even inspector, allowing someone else outside your area to take over control of a very high-profile case? Because that could make you look a little bit incompetent. So why was Abberline given the authority to interview Joseph Barnett? And what do you think actually happened in that room? Well, I understand why the police would have been looking at Joe Barnett. He looks sketchy as all get out. Like, firstly, straight out of the gun, you always look at the significant other of a murder victim. That's just standard procedure, as we know, because, oftentimes that will be the case. Not always. But they had a rocky relationship, apparently, Mary Kelly and Joe Barnett. They had been known to be fighting. In fact, they said a window was broken, possibly because something being thrown at the other person. And he turns up on the scene. He's coming back that very morning because he said he had heard something had happened in Miller's Court. And yes, word had spread quickly. So it's understandable why he would want to come back there. But many spouses will do that, well, even after they've committed this heinous crime, try and pretend like they're the loving partner. And they're horrified that an event's happened, even though they're the ones that have perpetrated it. So naturally, you're going to drag this bloke in and have a chat, which they do. Now, Abberline, it said, got Joe Barnett's room searched. So where he was now staying, they searched his room, went through his clothing, looked for a knife, inspected the clothing he was wearing. They found no blood and no knives. Now, that's part of the reason as to why they said Joe Barnett was innocent. He couldn't have done these crimes. But if they had have found blood on the clothes and a knife, Joe Barnett would either have to be one of 2 things. That cocky that he thinks he'll get away with it, or a complete imbecile. Turning back up onto the scene, you know the police are going to be looking at you. And you see some big hitters. Like Inspector Abberline is one of the people there. You'd be really nervous if you knew that, oh, hang on, I haven't hidden all the evidence. And that's the other point. He had plenty of time to get rid of clothes, get rid of the knife, wash up, remembering no DNA, so he could have easily covered his tracks. So that's the other thing. You could be looking at the fact that there was no evidence on him to suggest that maybe he did do it because he had all the time in the world to, 1, come up with an alibi, and 2, dispose of everything that could incriminate him. But that's why I think what happened in that interrogation room is interesting for a couple of reasons straight from the get-go. Would Inspector Abberline have wasted his time with Joe Barnett? I would suggest no, for 2 reasons. Yes, now I know people would say, you catch Jack the Ripper, that's really going to help your career. You're going to be shooting to the stars. So you want to be the one to nail him. But this was a very easy case to look into. So I believe Abberline would have looked at Joe Barnett and thought, well, look, one of these other blokes can interview him. Because it's either going to be an open and shut case that this was a domestic attack, or he's not the guy, and we really need to be looking at a larger net here. I don't need to waste my time with someone like him. So why did he spend 4 hours in an interrogation room? Well, I think the situation was a bit different to what most people assume. Knowing Abberline's speciality in Fenian movements. Now imagine you're Inspector Abberline for the moment and you are sitting across the table from Joe Barnett. You know you were brought back to uncover what may have been going on really in Whitechapel. You also are aware that some big attacks are planned by the Fenians, and your job is to try and stop them. And maybe this bloke sitting there may give you a few clues. Because you've seen the knives that may have been in that room. And maybe that was a message from the Fenians. Perhaps you knew that Mary Kelly may have been an informant or may have been an operative. Perhaps Joe Barnett is known to have Fenian sympathies, which would be reasonable. But either way, being of Irish descent, both of them, perhaps they might even unknowingly have some information. So how would you go about this conversation? Why do you think you're in this room, Joe? No. I don't care about that murder that happened in that room. I'm the chief inspector. I have way bigger priorities than whoever that was and you. But don't get me wrong, I'm happy to throw you in prison for the rest of your life, and I can do that. So we need to stop playing games, because you and I both know that you could not have identified that body so quickly. What, from the colour of the eyes and the hair? Come on, Joe. The person known as Mary Kelly, known as your girlfriend, has got about 3 different descriptions. I could go down the street now and say, what does Mary Kelly look like? And I'm going to get different responses. And you straight away, after seeing that scene, could say, that's my girlfriend. Come on. That just doesn't pass the pub test, Joe. And I'm not even worried about who was in that room, or if you even had something to do with it. I don't care. What I need is information. And you need to start thinking about yourself right now. Because it will be known, and trust me, I'll make it known, that you have been talking to me for quite a few hours. And so whoever you are involved with, well, do you think they won't come after you? Do you think what happened in 13 Miller's Court back there won't happen to you? Will they show you loyalty? Now, you can play dumb all you want and say, oh, I know nothing, and that's fine. I'll send you back out onto the street. You can fend for yourself. I will go home and I'll have a very good night's sleep. So you think about what I'm telling you, Joe. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to go outside and smoke my pipe for a little bit. When I come back in, you need to start telling the truth. You need to sing like a canary to save yourself. And trust me, I can protect you. I can let you disappear. Think about it. I'll be back in a minute. One more thing. You know, you said earlier that you collected everything from outside of that room when you left, when you split up with Mary Kelly? Well, we found a pipe in that room, Joe. Do you smoke a pipe? Is it your pipe? You see, I got you one way or another. Think about it. And you're going to say, Owen, that just makes no sense at all. It's a bit convoluted that Joe Barnett knew something, Mary Kelly was involved and everything, and yet when you look at what happened to the corpse that was in that room, it was taken outside of the jurisdiction to a different morgue. People, at least on 4 occasions, saw Mary Kelly after the time it said that she was murdered. And yet the coroner at the inquest shut that down, and the body was thrown into a common grave in a very short space of time. In the space of 2 weeks, this was shut down. Joe Barnett has disappeared, and the police are now saying the Jack the Ripper saga is over. Well, it wasn't just the work of Inspector Abberline who did that. No, there was a lot more involvement, even at a higher level, within the police departments. So even though Inspector Abberline is generally regarded as the main investigator in Jack the Ripper, the real person was Donald Swanson. Now, without going into great detail, Swanson was the chief inspector at Scotland Yard by the end of 1887. And so when the Jack the Ripper crimes really started making news, well, he was appointed solely to look into these crimes, and he was relieved of all other duties. Yes, anything to do with Jack the Ripper, whether it be a letter, whether it be a newspaper report, anything like that came across his desk. And this happened on the 8th of September, or just after the 8th of September, after the Annie Chapman crime. So we're only talking about 2 Jack the Ripper attacks so far, and they've set up this special investigative police operation at Scotland Yard. So the obvious question then is why? We had Fenian terror activities. There were gangs operating through London that were terrorising people, mugging people, and also taking people's lives. There was these worker rights, as we've mentioned before. So that there was riots happening over social issues. And yet the attack on 2 unfortunates all of a sudden became the most important thing to Scotland Yard and the local police. Now, I'm not saying that the lives of those 2 women, being Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, didn't mean anything, because every life does matter. And I believe in this channel I do try to humanise these victims. They're not just a bit player in the Jack the Ripper saga. They are very important. And the way their lives were ended, well, that was just, not good. And so it deserved a thorough investigation, absolutely. But back in those days, they would not have got much attention at all. In fact, even today, even in Australia, we have gangs who, do drug deals or whatever it is, and these gang people go and shoot one another. And the general public go, well, just as long as they're keeping that amongst themselves, we really don't care. But the moment someone outside this gang gets affected by it, well, now the public get up in arms, saying this has to be stopped. We got to do something about it. And back in Whitechapel, London, 1888, the lives of a couple of unfortunates really would have only been a small blip on the radar at all. Because when we think about it, the Thames Torso murders were happening in parallel, as we've mentioned many times in this video, and they weren't getting any attention. And Donald Swanson was not appointed to look into them, just these particular crimes. Question: what qualified Donald Swanson to take on this particular responsibility? Well, it is of note that he had a big hand in looking into the Fenian terror activities during 1881 to 1885. And yes, he had investigated some very famous burglaries and recovered the stolen items and also caught the criminals involved. So he was a big deal. So again, it might be surprising that Donald Swanson was put in charge of these 2 crimes in Whitechapel. But why? Why would there be this need for a police officer, a high-ranking one who specialised in Fenian activity, to keep an eye on what was happening there? Well, we really need to understand the political scene and what was happening back then. Now, it was only a few months prior to this, before these attacks happening, probably 6-7 months maybe. But the Jubilee plot happened in 1887, late 1887. Queen Victoria was going to celebrate the Jubilee year, and the Fenians planned to take her out, blow her up, literally. And that plot got foiled. And Donald Swanson was part of that investigation. Now, why? Why were they targeting Queen Victoria? Well, it all goes back basically to what the whole issue was over. If you were Catholic, you had these penal laws against you. You couldn't own land, you couldn't do much, you were being kept down. And the head of the Church of England was the monarch. In fact, the King James Bible was made because King James wanted to break away from the Catholic rule, sever ties with the Pope, and the Church of England was born. And so if you were a Catholic person, who are you going to go after but the head of the organisation that is keeping you down? It was more just a symbolic gesture, it would have been, because Queen Victoria herself probably wouldn't have had that much influence back in those days. Even though she had more than what the monarchs do in England today, they were starting to lose that power. But in 1888, or 1887 I should say, that would have caused a massive stir. Now the Fenian movement was starting to ramp up even after this plot got foiled, because of that political situation. When Gladstone, he gets elected, he's trying to get home rule in for the Irish people, and he gets rolled. The party splits up and he loses power. And it took another 4 years before that could change. So as political tensions are rising, you take your main investigator away from that and put him in charge of the murder of 2 people in Whitechapel. Now you might say right now, well, Owen, you're sort of drawing a long bow here with this Fenian activity and the police really looking into that instead of investigating who was actually murdering these unfortunates. But here's a little bit of extra detail. Now the head of the city police, I think his name's James Fraser, he actually put out a £300 reward for information that would lead to the capture of Jack the Ripper. The Vigilance Committee, they raised a £200 reward that would lead to information for capturing the same bloke. The Metropolitan Police, the Mets, they offered nothing. So the main ones who inserted themselves into the investigation when they felt like it, so Scotland Yard didn't actually do much in the regard of offering anything to capture this bloke. But they did pull in Inspector Abberline and Donald Swanson, 2 experts in Fenian activity, to investigate. Well, now we actually need to look at the higher level of the investigation into these 5 crimes. And yeah, we're now starting to get into all 5, because there must have been something that would make the upper brass decide to bring these people in. And there was some political maneuvering going on, and there's another totally unrelated theory which we're going to touch on, not to do with Fenians, but to do with just political machinations within the police force. But first we need to consider Sir Charles Warren, who was appointed as Police Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in 1886. Now, this was a controversial appointment. And in fact, another person who's a big player in the Jack the Ripper investigation, James Munro, he wanted the job. He didn't get the job. He was made assistant. And we might think then, why did Charles Warren get the job? Well, the bloke who was commissioner before him, Henderson, he'd been sitting on his hands, most people thought. They're just thinking, well, you know, like, this police force is turning into a bit of a rabble, and they were stretched because of the Fenian terror plots. They were under the pump all across England. Well, they're saying this Henderson, he's just basically doing nothing. So we need to bring in someone that can bring order, method, discipline to this police force, which Sir Charles Warren could do so with his military background. Now, it's said that he didn't really get along very well with the blokes on the street, the police constables who were patrolling, but he did get along well with his superintendents, but not so well with the upper brass. And particularly when you got Munro on the side just sort of sniping at him. And their relationship is interesting. But it probably didn't help Sir Charles Warren that the Home Secretary Matthews actually wanted Munro as well. So Sir Charles Warren was up against it a little bit. Would appear that maybe some people were out to make him look just a little bit silly. Now, coincidentally, it was the night before the crime scene happened in Miller's Court to Mary Kelly that Sir Charles Warren resigned for the second time. But unlike the first time, which we're going to talk about, but this time, his resignation was accepted. And so, could you imagine the shock the following morning when this most horrendous scene has happened in Miller's Court? And now the commissioner, well, he's gone, but he hung around until the 1st of December. And then they had a replacement in spot for him. Interestingly, it was straight after this. It was in that November period before December 1st when Sir Charles Warren stepped away that the investigation disappeared. The interest in these crimes died away real quickly. So the theory that I was talking about before, which was unrelated to the Fenians, is that these crimes, not caused by the police, but they were able to use the press and publicity to put pressure on Sir Charles Warren, make him look incompetent, and then he would leave, and then they could put in the person they wanted to run the police. And that theory is not of my doing. It has been around for a while, that it could have just solely been that. I don't think so because of everything else. And again, it's not saying the police did the crimes, but they could make connections between 5 victims and turn it into a press sensation. But there is one little connection to the Fenian theory that Sir Charles Warren has, and that's with the graffiti that was on the wall in Gulston Street. Now, some people believe that particular writing on the wall is a total red herring. Just some random probably put that up there. Remember, the police constable, though, said, I never saw the writing on the wall, but he also apparently never saw a knife. There's a fair delay between the attack in Mitre Square and when that knife would have been disposed of. So it's debatable if the policeman just missed it, which is a possibility. But if not, did Jack the Ripper put that writing up? Well, if so, it's just of note. 2 things here. Firstly, Charles Warren was later to have said it appeared to be written by an Irish person because it contained some Irish vernacular and the way things were written. But the second point is we will never know, because it was Sir Charles Warren that said, let's rub this off. Let's get rid of it because we don't want to cause an uproar against the Jews. There were other policemen standing there saying, we really need a photo. We want to get a photograph of this. And then there was a debate even at the inquest of whether or not what was actually said on that wall. And to be honest, we will never truly know. But could it have been the higher-ups instructing Charles Warren to remove that writing so that the involvement of perhaps an Irish group could be hidden? Well, for that to happen, it would have had to have come from a higher source than the commissioner himself. And so now we look at the Home Secretary, Matthews. Now, Matthews was the Home Secretary during the Jack the Ripper crimes. And what is really intriguing here is that he was the first Catholic in cabinet, basically for either ever or a very long time. Yeah, because Catholics were still under these penal laws, but somehow Matthews managed to become Home Secretary. But it could have been for this reason that Queen Victoria herself had some rather scathing comments about Matthews. Basically, just to paraphrase, saying, I would expect more of a barrister who's had a bit of experience in life. I would have thought that they would have dealt with this situation a lot differently, but he's showing a lot of naivety. Now, could you imagine that coming from the Queen, who did still have some influence, and just absolutely slamming this Home Secretary? Was it because he was Catholic, or was he not doing a great job? Well, interestingly, though, he ended up getting knighted. He is known as Sir Henry Matthews. So the Queen's comments obviously may have been there to make a statement. And she was actually talking about the Jack the Ripper crimes. And Queen Victoria had a great deal of interest in these 5 crimes. Which is also interesting considering the Fenians wanted her gone. Was that a reason why she seemed to be really captivated by the crimes there in Whitechapel? But during the Jack the Ripper saga, it was just where Henry Matthews also comes back into it. The police were scratching their heads, like the police on the beat. They're like, we've got no idea what's going on. It was Sir Henry Matthews that actually sent a bit of a memo out saying, if anyone wants a bit of a hint on who Jack the Ripper could be, go talk to James Munro. Well, that's interesting. Why would James Munro, who was Assistant Commissioner for a while under Sir Charles Warren, know a little bit about the Jack the Ripper crimes? Well, firstly, we need to look at Robert Anderson, who was the person who replaced Munro as Assistant Commissioner. Now, we need to touch on this. When Sir Charles Warren and James Munro were working together, they, as stated, weren't getting along. But it all came to a head when Munro wanted to appoint Sir Melville Macnaghten to a particular role in the police force. Sir Charles Warren said no, so they had a throwdown. They went, right, I resign. I can't work with him, you make the choice. And that's what both of them said. And it was Sir Charles Warren, his resignation was not accepted, but they accepted Munro's. And then Robert Anderson comes in replace of Munro. So you would think that James Munro really had nothing more to do with this endeavour of Jack the Ripper. In fact, it hadn't started when these events happened. But in fact, they moved Munro to a different division, because it's interesting as well that Robert Anderson had been working very closely with James Munro before his appointment. Well, we need to see his history first. Anderson says, I'm an anglicised Irishman of Scottish descent, is how he describes himself. Well, he wasn't Irish, though he was born in Dublin. So I would suggest that he's saying, well, look, I'm born of English parents in Ireland, but I have somewhere some Scottish ancestry. But he certainly wasn't sympathetic to the Irish people, and he was a barrister, he was a lawyer. His father was involved in the anti-Fenian activity, like he was trying to stop them, and that was a cause that Robert Anderson himself picked up, and in a big way. So all through late 1860s up to 1877, Robert Anderson was involved in political crimes, as it was known, which was the pseudonym for Fenian activity, and he was advising government on what was going on in that regard. But by 1877, the Fenian movement had died down a little, but the government and the authorities didn't want to lose his skills, and so they found jobs for him to do, heading up committees and all sorts of things so they could keep him on the books, because they didn't want him to lose interest and maybe go back to the private sector. And then in 1881, when the bombings began again, well, then he could move back into his full role, and along with Swanson, along with Abberline and a few others, trying to bring that under control. And yet, he got Munro's job after they accepted Munro's resignation. But immediately upon receiving it, he went over to the continent, as it was known, because his doctor said, look, you need a bit of time away. You're a bit stressed, so go relax. And he made a comment before he left, because the Jack the Ripper crimes had started. And he basically said, look, these crimes are just being over-sensationalised in the press. Really don't need to be around for this. But oddly, he did cut short his little sojourn on the continent when the press blew this up even more so. So he came back to look into the Jack the Ripper crimes. But it is important to note that his role in the Fenian bombings and stopping them was that he was the head and directed the spies who were infiltrating the Fenian group. So again, we have another very highly decorated and involved police officer trying to hunt down Jack the Ripper. But what happened with Munro? Because as we said, his resignation was accepted, and he had been working very closely with Anderson on the Fenian bombings. So why, if this was a Fenian plot, would you sideline another very good investigator? Well, let's have note that even though he resigned, they moved him to head the Special Irish Branch, which is still now known as the Special Branch. So what they effectively did was move him out from the authority of Sir Charles Warren. And not only that, they encouraged police officers to go to Munro, as the Home Secretary did, instead of going to Sir Charles Warren about the Jack the Ripper crimes. And then finally we get down to Sir Melville Macnaghten. Now everyone is aware of the Macnaghten memo. We are going to talk about that very briefly, but he came in place of Sir Charles Warren. Now, it's important to see here that eventually Munro got his way, got his buddy into a role that he wanted. And the reason why these two had a great connection is they served together in India, and it's stated that Munro actually got involved in a literal scuffle and could have been in danger of getting seriously hurt, and Macnaghten came to his aid. So from that moment, they had this really close bond. And that's why Munro was prepared to put his job on the line for Macnaghten. But it's generally accepted that Macnaghten got most of his information about the Jack the Ripper crimes from Munro, because Macnaghten was not involved in the investigation at all. Even though a very lesser known comment that Macnaghten made later, this is after he wrote the famous memo, but he was said to have stated that he believed the Jack the Ripper crimes were a Catholic plot. Now, some people have taken that comment and ran with it and talk about the royal conspiracy and Prince Albert marrying a young Catholic girl. Or could he have been referring to the Fenian activity being the real Catholic plot? Well, there is a dissenting view to that, which I have to bring up right here. Because it's said that Munro actually believed wholeheartedly that Montague Druitt was Jack the Ripper. And he was going to name Montague Druitt after Montague Druitt was found in the River Thames. He was going to name him as Jack the Ripper. But Montague Druitt's brother came out and said, if you do that, if you name my brother as Jack the Ripper, I am going to name all the homosexuals in the police force, in the government, in the clergy. I will embarrass a lot of people. Now, if that was true, that would actually make a lot more sense as regards a few comments people have made about, well, we kept the name quiet for the sake of the family, and the police sort of just hushing things over real quickly. But you would say, well, didn't Macnaghten mention Montague Druitt as the main suspect if he got that information from Munro? Well, yes, but that was an internal memo. That was not meant for publication in the public, and it wasn't public knowledge for quite a few years after the event, where any damage obviously wasn't going to be done. So that probably carries a little bit more weight than you would normally think it would, which lends me to think, Montague Druitt needs another look as well, which will be coming at some point down the track. So that would explain why it's been said that Munro kept very quiet about the Jack the Ripper crimes, but also he was known to have said that the whole issue, the whole saga, was a political hot potato. Well, naming people, and just, okay, back in those days, naming people as being homosexual would have been a huge issue. It was still illegal in London back then. And the general consensus of the populace, it was a terrible thing. And so that would have embarrassed a lot of people. I mean, obviously different today, but it would have been a very sensitive issue in 1888. Yet the other hot potato political issue of the day, which was more prevalent, was the Fenian movement. There was the person Parnell who was in Parliament. So the Fenian group had this terrorist side, we would call it, but they also had a legitimate political party. And I think it was similar to like the IRA and Sinn Féin back in the 70s and 80s. I'm not sure someone can correct me on that. The thing is, Parnell was trying to get political change. It would not have served Parnell and his party any good if the police started making connections to the Fenian group, whether they did these 5 crimes or not. Because then the general public in England would have been dead against any changes to Home Rule, and the Irish people probably would have, basically copped it down the street. So with all that in mind, I put this to the pub test. Firstly, do I think the Fenians necessarily had something to do with all 5 of these crimes? No, I don't. Could there have been a connection in Miller's Court? Possibly. And I'll get into that detail a little bit later. But could the police have used these crimes for their own ends? When I say the police, I mean the upper echelon. They're reporting to government. And with Parnell being in government, they go to him and say, you've got influence over these Fenian terrorists. We know that. I mean, it's obvious. You've both got the same goals. But we're making it evident that every main anti-Fenian police officer, every big hitter, every big deal is working on this case. It won't take us much to use the press the way we're already using them to basically tell everyone that this is an Irish attack. What support do you think you're going to get? You'll get nothing, so call your attack dogs off. We know you've got some more attacks planned, which they did, by the way. So we want you to stop it, or you will not achieve your political ends. And maybe even former Prime Minister Gladstone was part of these conversations. Now, to me, that passes the pub test. Because a couple of reasons. You'd say that is an extremely strong view to have. But why did the Thames Torso murders not get the media attention that these 5 crimes did? Why did a lot of other activities that were going on in London not receive the same press? How could the police, or authorities I should say, shut down the Jack the Ripper hullabaloo so quickly if they didn't have some control over the press? Like they had spies in the Fenian group, they would have had informants or people that they could feed information to in the press to make something either jump up or disappear. And perhaps they received some information after the attack in Miller's Court. And you'd say, but Owen, that is drawing a conspiracy that's just not there. Except, remember, a few things here. We know nothing about Mary Kelly, really, other than what Joe Barnett himself basically said. There's no proof that she came from Limerick. There's no proof she was ever in Cardiff. And she just disappeared. And there's some little bit more information I'm going to get into about Mary Kelly shortly. The biggest issue in the day was Home Rule. An election was fought over it in 1886 and it brought down a government. So it was very, very sensitive. There were terrorist attacks planned after that election when Home Rule was off the table now, and they tried to take out Queen Victoria. So the police were heavily involved in trying to suppress Fenian movements. And then they bring in all the high-ranking police officers to investigate the crimes against what was considered 5 very lowly unfortunates, which prior to this would not have basically made a paragraph in the paper, let alone make the front page. And on that very day in Miller's Court, McCarthy and Barnett themselves are as sketchy as anything. Like, what was McCarthy doing for the 8 minutes when Indian Harry's already off to the races to the police? And Indian Harry is another topic we'll touch on. But Barnett coming back down to Miller's Court seems also very odd, as we've discussed. Except there is just one bit more information which I find intriguing in this particular scenario, and that is Mary Kelly herself and what she was doing on the days and the day leading up to this event. Now, her and Joe had split up. They said that a window got broken, apparently something being thrown at somebody. But that window being broken in 13 Miller's Court allowed access into that room for someone without a key. So, Mary Kelly is now having women come in to use the room. On the morning of the crime happening, a woman is seen in that room with her. But the night of the attack, Mary Kelly is heard singing. She's seen coming into the room with someone with a carroty mustache, and then she's singing. And she's singing for at least an hour, to the point and so loud that someone up top wanted to get her husband to go down and sort it out. And he says, look, just leave her. She's having fun. Now, obviously, this didn't happen every night. Because if it did, I don't think the husband would have said, oh, look, just let her go. I think he'd be like, got to sort this out. I want to sleep too. But the medical examiner who found the body actually placed the initial time of death before the singing started. But because there was so much evidence that Mary Kelly was still alive at the inquest, he changed his testimony. He said, well, look, okay, it could have been later. Now, admittedly, like forensic science isn't what it is today. But it is of note, at that point, he believed that she had passed away around 11 o'clock at night. And that lock on Mary Kelly's room meant that you could unlock it from the window, and as you leave, you could pull it closed, and it would lock, because it was a spring lock. You didn't need the key. You only need the key to go through the front door if you didn't get your hand through the window. So Joe Barnett knew about that. Mary Kelly knew about that. So I would suggest that they were setting up a bit of an alibi here. See, nobody would have gone looking for Mary Kelly that morning at all because they heard her singing until the wee hours. And so then you would assume, well, she's having a big sleep in. And you probably forget about it until the following day, and then Mary Kelly and Joe Barnett's disappeared. Except for Indian Harry. Indian Harry, and does anyone not find this disturbing? Like, he knew about the broken window because he could pull the curtain back. Now, you tell me, like, I'm pretty sure, I've never been to England. It is on the list of things to do, but I've never been there. But my understanding is that the curtains are on the inside of the building, not on the outside. Which means Indian Harry is putting his hand through the window to pull the curtain back to have a look in at this young lady who was known to keep company with other men. Not creepy at all, is it? But because he did that, he saw the scene and then raises the alarm. McCarthy, then he's like, well, what am I going to do? Because I got some really sketchy stuff happening and I'm going to have every high-ranking police officer turning up at my building. So then he had to go into panic mode as well. But then that would have led, no doubt, to some information being sent to Mary Kelly, who was seen on 4 occasions after this crime apparently had happened, including at a pub with a well-dressed person. And no doubt information could have been sent to Joe Barnett saying, you better hightail it down here, buddy, because this plan has gone awry. And then he, in that interrogation room with Inspector Abberline, gives the information needed to allow them to disappear. Now, there is more information I could have brought into this, but I had to draw a line under it somewhere. But let me know what you think. Does this pass the pub test? Do you think the higher authorities could have used these crimes for their own political means? Well, it's possible, and it's not like these things don't happen today as well. But let me know what you think. This has been quite the long one and a lot of information to take in. And I'll be very, very interested to know what you think of this particular theory. But moving forward, there is a lot more Jack the Ripper content coming. We've got some interesting things in the works. Plus, other cases that I find fascinating will be appearing here on the pub test. As always, your viewing is greatly, greatly appreciated. Thank you to all who are sharing this content as well. If you don't want to miss a single one of these videos, give us a like, give us a subscribe. I'm Owen, you've been watching the pub test, and we will see you on the next one.